Thanks very much for inviting me here. And just to make a correction, it was 34 hours. If you count the connecting times and stuff. So I guess when Javier invited me, I was wondering why I should come, considering that I was only just beginning to do some wetlands kind of research, but hadn't done that much or published that much. And that I also found out that this is such a complex topic that it's amazing. So it's not loud enough. But in the end, I decided I wanted to come just because I had a PhD student who was very involved in mangroves, working in Thailand as well as in Queensland, Australia, and also that wetlands is such a complex topic and I love those challenges. So it really is a way to integrate a lot of scientific principles. And also because I love Spain, I wanted to come here. Okay, so I guess I don't need to go too much into this since everyone is very much aware of everything that's involved with wetlands. It's such a complex and such a diverse field, even just defining what wetlands are or just trying to make an inventory of everything that can be classified as a wetland. But these are very important areas. They're critical, they have a lot of ecosystem services. They do everything from shoreline stabilization, helps in tsunamis, to inland carbon sinks and so on. So remote sensing has played a role, not as big a role as it should have, in looking at wetlands. And for the most part, there are a lot of Earth observation studies that we can point to, and I'm going to just briefly overview a few of those. And they can be used to map the current extent, in some cases degradation, in more cases declines or disappearances, or where they are and so on. And what I wanted to do today is kind of focus more on the temporal aspects rather than composition and aerial distributions. And I think these are some of the big challenges that lay ahead in trying to complete the story about wetlands and meet the criteria for stakeholders as far as how they're going to manage these areas and how we can best conserve these things. So I'm going to be talking about like seasonal variations, interannual variations, and how we can start looking at what drives wetlands, what drives their productivity and functioning. And if we understand what the drivers are and how they interplay with one another in complex ways, then you can understand how the future may impact and be able to predict what will happen if such and such happens in the foreseeable future. So roughly that's what I'm going to try to attempt to cover. It's such a big area that I won't be able to get into everything, so I want to do a survey and hit on some things. At times some of this might seem random, but trust me, there is some kind of flow to it. So basically mapping, which is to its largest extent exploiting the spatial properties of satellite data, get into some of the physical characteristics and then the functioning and process in the temporal domain. And I guess if there is some time, maybe a little bit of the resilience and challenges. So I found a good overview article here by Lisa Gallant that gets into the challenges. So if you're interested, it's a pretty comprehensive look at these things. But I mean, it's not like a shrubland or a forest type where we know something is a forest or something is a shrubland or a grassland. It's not a discrete type of land cover situation because it doesn't fit the normal land cover classification schemes. If anything, it's the presence of water that seems to define it, but then the water can be on the surface, it can be submerged, groundwater, it can be ephemeral, seasonal, permanent. So that's why it's just really hard to classify these systems. The other thing about this is that they're highly dynamic, so the fact that they're so dependent on water, which means that you could have a sudden storm surge or sudden depletion of water or spring popping out, and almost within a day or two you could have a change in the wetland condition. So these are some of the reasons why it's so hard to map these things. Okay, so just for Australia, I was kind of looking at what are the big wetland types. And these are the Ramsar wetlands in Australia, their classification. And we ran into alpine, so even Australia does have one alpine region that actually has snow sometimes. And there you'll find wetlands. There's wetlands throughout the whole center, and especially in the southeast corner, where you get into these arid wetlands where they're fed by streams coming from the more humid tropical portions in the north. Coastal marine wetlands, they're in the right category to have a lot of mangroves on both sides, northeast and northwest side, estuarine, riverine wetlands, and groundwater dependent systems. And then these are our toolbox. And of course, my picture of the planet makes it look like there's only Australia. There is another side. And actually, if we go exactly to the other side from Sydney, we will hit just off the east coast of Spain. So, anyway, so through this whole big array of satellites, people have had very nice studies about wetlands, using radar, all kinds of radar systems, and more hyperspectral systems, Landsat, of course, and the hyperspatial systems, QuickBird, Worldview, and all of these have some good studies that can be shown with respect to what was accomplished. What I like about it now is that there's a lot of interest in fusing multiple satellite systems, radar, optical, and there's also these what we call more coarse resolution satellite systems like GRACE, solar-induced fluorescence sensors, and 2 as an example. And even MODIS, that at coarse scales, they're actually very useful for functioning type studies and looking at the processes and drivers of wetland dynamics. So this would be the first part, which is the mapping aspects, and probably we're all familiar with these. And again, even though it may be simple, it may seem simple to map wetlands, but again, this is an array of all different types of wetland systems. And depending on the time of the year, you may get a totally different signal here and confuse your technique of mapping or falsely interpret the presence or extent of wetlands. So again, they're highly dynamic and so on. They can include peat bogs, mud flats, all kinds of these systems, brackish salt waters, and so on. And through these mapping techniques, and again, I would like to stress that probably even though you can be a defeatist and kind of take the view that it's just way too complex to effectively map everything, the other side of that coin is that if you can have a fairly decent methodology for mapping, even though it's not perfect, and of course you can always leave the perfectionism to other advances as the technology gets better. But if you can formulate a consistent technique to map something, at least you'll be able to monitor it year after year after year and have some kind of confidence that there is a trend and something is happening to it. So despite the fact that you may not have a perfect system, and someone may even argue you don't have a complete radiative transfer scheme to do this, it works. You can still have very good wetland indices derived from satellite systems, and they do tell us the trends, and most of those trends are dismal. So this would be from a Ramsar report showing basically that wetland global extent index, freshwater living planet index, all of these are continuously sliding and rapidly on the diminishing returns here. So wetlands are threatened. Despite many attempts, they're still continuing to degrade and are lost. And this would probably be the best note among the wetland reports. At least in Europe, it's not as bad as the rest of the world. But you still see a loss here, despite many comprehensive attempts to conserve and monitor these things and manage them. And this would be an example of another wetland mapping study, specifically the work by Kiri in mangroves. And I think what was amazing about this, using the spatial techniques of remote sensing and historical access to remote sensing to the archives. Geary et al., they took over 1,000 scenes of Landsat and were able to generate this first comprehensive map of the extent of and presence of mangroves globally throughout the world. So that's pretty an amazing feat to be able to do that, not only do that in a consistent manner, but to actually go backwards in time and look at how the same methodology to map something has shown a decrease of mangrove extent over time. So he had a few results here, the exact roughly an aerial estimate of the area of mangroves, how many countries have mangroves, the fact that most of them are present in the tropical and subtropical regions, and basically that all in all, his results showed a 12% lower estimate of wetlands than what was then the existing figure used by the United Nations. And that was his, the rest of the global map of wetlands and the latitudinal distribution, which I thought was kind of cool to look at. Because that latitudinal distribution gives you some indications of some climatic external drivers at play. And most likely in this case it was the temperature factor. And then these are some other studies that I grabbed from another review by Claudia Kunzer. And basically what she did is in a nice review paper, she went through step-by-step methodologies of how people in the literature are mapping wetlands. And she went into the spatial aspects. Here's an example of the spectral aspects. We're looking at different species of mangrove leaves. You can get quite distinct spectral signatures. And so in the spectral domain, there's been a lot of good successes. Spectrally, you can also get into the polarimetric and radar signals and how they're able to, at different wavelengths, L, C-band, X-band, and so on, derive parameters about wetlands. And these are some examples with the radar, and then fusing the radar with either spot data here, and I believe that was ASAR and SAR-X data being fused together to generate maps of wetlands. So again, we're talking about spatially mapping something and being able to at least assess your inventory, what you have, because you can't manage something if you don't know what you have. This I can't get into too much, but I thought this is extremely valuable, the fact that for different types of satellite systems, in this case medium resolution systems like Landsat, she actually went through and explored the benefits and costs and weaknesses, limitations of each of these types of methods to map wetlands. And this is sort of independent of the idea of fusing these systems. So I'm not going to go through the table all that much, but that was using high spatial resolution. And I guess the main thing there would be just the cost and the fact that you can only get very small areas mapped. And this is hyperspectral, so the fact that there is potential there in the hyperspectral domain. And this is the idea of using radar, some of the limitations and advantages there. So in her discussion, she gets into the actual mixing them together. So the point about mapping with wetlands is the fact that all of these systems have their advantages and disadvantages. And if anything, the challenge is going to be how to then mix the different systems. Take a hyperspectral sensor, take a hyperspatial sensor, take a medium resolution, or something that can monitor day to day, and start fusing these systems because each of them have unique information. And it's obvious that you can't do it unless you have parts of each. So Landsat may be great, but of course it can't pick up the different species that a hyperspectral signal might be able to do, and so on. We can go on and on with these kind of discussions. And you can always find the best system for your local area, but what if your idea was to do a national inventory and go through all the different types of wetlands? I mean, we just went through how complex a wetland is. So you may have the best system, but it may only work in a salt marsh area. Okay, so temporal component. So this gets a little bit into what I like to do. And temporal component, this would be an example of notice. But the idea here is that you are looking at something. This is the state of New South Wales, eastern coast of Australia. It's probably the size of Spain. No. Do you think? So the idea that if you can put something in animation or put it in motion, you can see a lot more than you would probably have missed. In fact, if we look at the temporal pattern of this greenness index, some of it you may even consider to be highly noisy. But if we look at it this way, you can actually see there's a definite rhythmic pattern to this. And that's pretty amazing because Australia is such a, does not have a standard climate signal. It's one of the most erratic places from that perspective. The climate variability is #1 in the world, which is a nice testing lab if you ever want to test your climate extreme measures here. But you can see the rhythmic pattern of basically the understory or grass forb layers greening up with a stable evergreen woody vegetation in the background. And if we look at the signal there on the lower right-hand side, we see that basically these actually corresponded to pollen outbreaks of grass pollen, allergenic grass pollen. So it's an area that became very useful for aerobiology and public health in New South Wales. And basically it's also considered a macro ecological feature because we're looking at broad patterns and how they constrain local processes. So the same idea was proposed by Ellison here in her paper, which was the macroecology of mangroves. So looking again at large-scale patterns and processes, which you may think are too coarse to look at something so local that you're interested in, but these are the drivers that are going to constrain what's happening at the local scale, so you need both of them to understand what's happening locally. What's amazing about this too is that there's actually 2 double peaks in there, but some years it forgets 1 peak, other years it gets the double peak, so there's an autumn grass peak and a spring grass peak, because we're in a subtropical area, so we have a mix of C4 subtropical grasses and C3 temperate grasses. So those 2 combined produce this double peak in there. But depending on the climate that year, you can totally forget one of those peaks. So temporal domain, we're interested in then all the drivers that are acting on a target and then measuring its response. So it's a perfect laboratory experiment. You subject a wetland site or any other ecosystem to some perturbation, whether it's from land use activities or nutrient release or weather patterns, fire or whatever. And with satellites, you can just measure what the result of that impact. And to me, that's one of the beauties of satellite remote sensing. You can actually track something over time and compare it before and after. And sometimes we can call this seasonality from space, ecosystem seasonality. So basically, if we were to capture a seasonal pattern of many of these areas here, any given pixel, you'll find that it's a very unique pattern, unique spectral, unique temporal signature with a lot of information content in there. And that's the task. How do you extract that information from a temporal fingerprint? So both aquatic and landscapes have basically diverse seasonal responses. A mangrove may react to radiation differently than an adjacent upland forest type, separating out temporally yet being indistinguishable spectrally. So there's all kinds of nice cases like this that we can find. And plus a seasonal signal like that represents all of the drivers acting on that pixel. So it's an integrated value, which means that you don't always know what was the cause of it, but it's helping you diagnose what's happening to the land. So I guess from a wetland perspective, we can look at primarily hydrologic and meteorology as being external drivers to wetlands' temporal signatures. hydrologic because it could be the groundwater rising levels up and down, or it could still be rain, or it could be rainfall that fell 100 kilometers away, but it's going to basically come towards you, or it could be temperature patterns, radiation. And then this is something that's not basically appreciated much in any type of remote sensing and ecology, and that's the fact that these aren't just plants that are stupid and waiting for the climate to do something to it. They also have some intelligence in themselves, and they also have ecophysiological traits where they can generate a certain population of leaves, decide when they're going to flush, and do all kinds of things to avoid insects, or all kinds of patterns like that. And that gets into the ecophysiology of these canopy systems too. So all of these are at play in producing that temporal signal. And of course, climate modelers most often ignore the biologic part and just focus on the meteorologic part. And this whole driver point of view can be appreciated by looking at the Namani paper in Science, where if we look at globally the main climatic drivers here, we can appreciate that most of the world is a mix of whether you're light limited, water limited, temperature limited. And in wetlands, water limited takes a whole universe in itself because the water can come from below as well as above, adjacently, horizontally, right? But same concept applies, and many of these systems are mixed. They fall not at the edge of the triangle, but somewhere in the middle in there. But again, if you're going to understand what's happening with climate and variability, then you need to at least kind of get at what the drivers are. Maybe I'll skip this, but the idea here is that when you look at a seasonal signature and phenology, this basically turns on the whole biogeochemical cycle, it turns on the whole hydrologic cycle. So when a plant flushes, it starts extracting water, evaporating it, and basically until that plant decides to turn on, you don't have that flow of water going up and nutrients inside. So it's interconnected. And I wanted to just show some examples of what I mean by temporal fingerprints. This is, again, the state of New South Wales. And in this case, I'm looking at it month by month on the top row, and year after year after year, going down from top to bottom. So basically, we're looking January to December on the top, and I should have labeled it, but 2000 to the year 2012, streaming down to the bottom here. And what's quite remarkable is how easy you can see periods of drought where the area turns reddish. And you can compare it along the column and see that it's not normal. And you can also see periods of flushing and extreme wet periods here, La Nina events in here, by looking at these spatial temporal fingerprints like this. And maybe you've probably all seen this, but the idea of the phenology. So the same concept can apply, of course, to many wetland areas. That you'll have a turn-on period, a peak productivity period, peak functioning area, and then basically a slowdown. Okay. And from that, we can generate images of any particular time of that cycle. So the parameter here is the day of the year, not the y-axis variable here. So this is a map showing you at what day did you get the peak productivity period for any given location in the year. So we know that prior to that, we were still greening up. After this peak day, you're going to start browning down. So fire managers are interested in this because of when you initiate dry down activity. And peak productivity is also a time that a lot of people sample on the ground. So I'm going to skip through this. And this is the same data, but now looking at a basin, a catchment in itself in Sydney, with wetland areas and lake areas in there. So again, the same idea, the fingerprint concept there. You can put that in 3D And you're looking at a reservoir, lake systems here, the urban area in blue, and some mangrove spots along the coast here. But the values here of the, it's not topography, even though they almost approximate each other, but it's actually the variable that you're looking at, greenness in this case. And you can set this in motion and basically watch connectivity patterns. How does area stay green for how long? Are there periods where seasonally they dry down and then green up? And do you have a continuum in there, which is important for things like animal movements, insect activity? Mosquitoes need a certain break in moisture content that they can serve as a barrier. Okay, and then that's the temporal signatures. And that's just another way to display patterns. The time now is session. Okay, so these are some examples I found where this is a study in China, the largest lake in China, Tahu Lake, and using Landsat and Chinese satellite equivalent of the same spatial resolution. In this particular study, they used the seasonality curves to differentiate submerged vegetation from floating vegetation. So strictly using temporal signatures, they were able to separate the two, map the two, and monitor their long-term extent. One was actually increasing, I think that was the submerged one, and the other one decreasing. So the lake was basically shifting from more of a floating top from a submerged type vegetation, which had some important ecological warnings to that. And that would be their mapping based on these temporal signatures. And then they looked at the drivers by plotting air temperature and some other variables to assess what's what and what's lagging, to look at why something is changing. In this case, the increasing temperatures they thought were changing the system. Here's a study local to home. So this is Lake Eyre Basin, which is a very hyper-arid region in Australia. Yet despite this, it's got the largest concentration of wetlands in there. And these wetlands basically are coming from Queensland and northern New South Wales. So we're looking at more humid areas near the coast where you get sudden pulses of rainfall that if you wait a few months, those rainfall pulses result in streaks of river flow going towards the interior of Australia. So Australia doesn't have a natural drainage pattern. When it suffers a La Nina, most of that water basically never leaves the continent. It just goes in and towards the center and can only leave through evaporation most of the time. So here we can see nice clearly the streaks coming down in here, and you're looking at basically monthly steps in here. So it's really quite interesting dynamic in here. If we were to try to capture any given spot, you would see a pattern like this, where you can go through 4 or 5 years and not see anything happening, then all of a sudden flush of activity, instant wetland outburst, and the pulses come and diminish. And again, this is that extreme climate of Australia where you can go from total drought, the same types of drought suffered by Europe and Amazon and other places, to sudden flash points of La Nina events where everything just totally floods and becomes very strong. And I think I don't have time to get into that, but there was actually a paper published that recorded a global sea level drop when this occurred in Australia. So basically, so much water got dumped in Australia that globally sea level actually dropped, and it was measurable. I know you won't believe that. The citation is there. I didn't believe it either, so, but it is published. And this is just an index showing if you were to take rainfall in Australia and compare the interannual variability of rainfall there's the continents, and then there's Australia. And if you look at interannual productivity, same concept. It's just amazing how extreme it is in that continent. So it's fascinating to try to study how plants adapt to such a system. Okay. So if you use data like GRACE that can actually measure the total water that's present in areas, which I think would be highly useful for wetland studies, because you want to know the total presence of water from the surface all the way down to the ground. You can get these storage water deficits in here. You can measure water balance methods, how much water is coming in, how much is evaporating, and therefore based on the accumulation and loss, you can look at deficit periods and so on. So I think GRACE is a pretty good, exciting area to continue with wetland studies. And this is just an idea for that lake air, looking at the rainfall signal seasonally, January to December, TWS, total water storage from GRACE, and some greenness measured there. And you can actually start to see how closely the vegetation patterns would match with the GRACE data, much more so that it lines up with the precipitation data. And same idea, you're looking at these in figure format. And remember the GRACE data again, where you can quickly see the droughts and spurts of excess water. Okay, these were examples of phenology and hydrology, its combination. So the fact that phenology and hydrology can be intertwined so closely, basically I think is what then needs to happen to looking at things like wetlands and mangroves. Okay, as my time is running out, I had an example here of the paper just published about 3 months ago, I think, on Pantanal. Maybe Patricia will talk more about this afternoon. I thought it was really neat that they looked at the GRACE data itself and they found that the GRACE was able to account for the hydrologic distribution of the entire Pantanal area. They didn't get a complete total water closure, and they have some reasonings for that, mostly using model data for ET and things like that. But I think the fact that they're actually looking at these seasonal and interannual signals from multiple satellite platforms, I think is quite exciting. This is the same idea for the Nile Basin. So I thought these were kind of cool animations to show off. Looking at combinations of monthly values of GRACE data in the Nile Basin. And just show you that, and then you can see the lakes and some of the wetland areas there. And you see the nice rhythmic patterns to the data that I think tell you a lot about what's going on there. And they did it with the NDVI as well. So you can line these up in spatial animation format and actually visualize how NDVI is responding in accordance with how GRACE data, as well as they have rainfall and other data sets here. So the fact that they're fusing all these different satellite systems from TRIM, GRACE, MODIS, and so on, I think is something cool, but it's happening at a macro scale, of course. But I'm trusting that with technology developing and with fusion techniques, we'll be able to take more local scale, high resolution wetland stuff and put it into a temporal domain by fusing it MODIS Landsat, for example. Okay, this section here was meant to get into the whole groundwater dependent ecosystems. It's kind of neat that if you put a dendrometer on a tree, you can get a diurnal curve here, just because the tree also swells up with water and then releases water, and that's measurable. And then from day to day, you can actually get into a seasonal signal as the tree is actually in a growing season, and then when it's not. Okay. So that's riparian with the flux tower sites. So one way to look at ecosystem functioning would be to actually have flux towers at wetland sites. And this is MODIS data being perfectly lined up almost perfectly lined up with evapotranspiration at a mesquite pause wetland riparian area. So there is potential there. I'm not saying we're exactly there yet. And before I get in trouble, I think I'll show you. This is to highlight the future sensors. So someday fluorescence will tell us exactly the photosynthetic rates of different areas. And I think I'll skip and conclude with going back to Earth. And so the last message I would have is that none of this work that I've been showing off to you would mean much if you didn't have in situ ground data to validate, verify, and actually try to interpret correctly. Because much of remote sensing data, people are pretty much lazy. They look at the visual images and they interpret as they want to, as they see it. But no, there's no statistical backing to how they interpret this. And I could probably show you 100 studies that do exactly that. They say that's a drought, here's the vegetation index, therefore that caused that. But not even a statistical test to verify and show that that's true. So these are phenocams, which I think are kind of neat as a way to actually bridge the gap between in situ and satellite interpretations as to whether leaves are really greening up, or are they increasing in leaf area, or are they just going through demographics or physiologic changes. So here's a site that we put up in Thailand just earlier this year in April. And in this case, by fixing it to record hourly, well actually it records every 15 minutes, but we can watch the tidal presence, of course. But to have an idea of how this varies from month to month and year to year, and match this up then with spectral data that you can extract from a phenocam using RGB signals and in some cases NIR signals. I think it's quite cool to do. So my PhD students hoping that he can work on, he will get some results of this. And in this case here, we're just setting the time to record once every day in here, so you don't really see the tidal flows in there. And, it's a fixed time of day every day. In this case, this would be more useful for leaf phenology work. And you can just extract the circle in one area, you can look at a different species somewhere else. Okay, so I think I'll let this go to questions. So that's